Hello bakers, and today I'm going to do some of the most frequently asked questions and answers that I get on my Facebook group for bread making for beginners. And I was doing this earlier and my phone ran into a storage issue problem, so I had to quit and delete, and so now I'm starting over. So I think I'm going to go through this a little faster. I have a cheat sheet here that I'm going to use, but this is all things sourdough, from starter to the actual bake and cooling of your bread. That means there's lots of steps, and so I wanted to go through it quickly. I'm not trying to teach you how to make bread, I'm just sort of showing you what I use. I started with this, I used to make 100 grams of water, 100 grams of flour starter, and discard all but 25 grams every day. But I got so much pushback on that and the wasted flour. And so I came across, maybe 3 or 4 months ago, I came across a YouTube reel that showed making a starter with 1 tablespoon of flour and 1 tablespoon of water, and it was called a no discard starter. And I've been touting that on my group and on here on YouTube ever since because it was amazing. It's very fast. It takes about 8 to 10 days at the longest, whereas the bigger one took 2 to 3 weeks. And the more you have, the longer it's going to take to ferment. That's my supposition. That's my science to me. So this little teeny tiny bit of 1 tablespoon of flour, 1 tablespoon of water is such a small amount that it allows it to ferment faster. So that's why I really love this. But I do store it in a very small ball jar. It's a half a pint, and I put a rubber band on it to show where I start, and I just have the little lid for a topper, but I don't screw it down. You want air in this thing because you need the natural bacteria in the air to make it ferment. So just put the lid on it and put it someplace nice, warm, and cozy where it's not going to get jostled. But I do like to make it in this little jar because it is such a tiny amount, as you can see by where that rubber band is. The lovely thing about this is that exact amounts are not required. You use about a tablespoon of unbleached all-purpose flour, and I use filtered water from my refrigerator door that I have set out on the counter for about 3 or 4 hours to allow the chlorine to evaporate. I go to too much trouble to make sourdough bread that I want to use the purest ingredients I can, and if I can get rid of the chlorine, that's a plus to me. So I use 1 tablespoon of my filtered water and 1 tablespoon of unbleached all-purpose flour. Mix it really well, really well. I like to do it in a little glass measuring cup so that I can see that it's gotten completely mixed. There's no dried flour. And then I kind of have to push it into this little jar. Then the next day you cover it, you leave it for 24 hours or so. It doesn't have to be exact. It can be 18 hours, it can be 28 hours, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be precise. Then the next day, in order for me to be able to clean my jar, I put it all into my measuring cup again. I add another tablespoon of flour, another tablespoon of water. I mix it really well, and if it's runny, add a little more flour. Add an extra half a tablespoon. Otherwise, put back in your jar, cover, and leave. Day 3, do the same thing. Day 4, I like to switch it up and add a tablespoon of flour, of bread flour. I like to switch it to bread flour and whole wheat flour. About a half a tablespoon to a tablespoon of whole wheat and a tablespoon of your bread flour now. Mix it really well. And at this point, you might want to move it to a pint-sized jar. It might start rising now, and you want to give it room to rise. And you don't need to be precise again, just make sure that it's the consistency of thick pancake batter, and get it into the jar, cover, leave in a warm spot. Now, day 5, feed it twice a day, maybe in the morning and before you go to bed. Stir it, go in and stir it 2 or 3 times during the day. Give it a really good stir and cover it up again. That will allow the natural bacteria from the air to help it ferment, and it'll ferment faster. But I do like using these jars You don't have to. Some people like these containers, these ones, but they're airtight. So be sure to remove this little lid or this little ring, because that little ring makes it airtight, and you don't want it airtight. You want there to be able to get some air in it. So these also are hard to get it in and out of. So I don't like these. I bought a whole bunch of these to use for baking, and then I didn't use them. We found other uses for them that we like a lot. So now, after about 8 days, when it's consistently rising up, put your rubber band on there and watch it. And if it rises up nearly to the top of the jar, let that happen 2 or 3 times. If you're feeding twice a day, you know, that'll be a day and a half, or once a day, that'll be 2 days. But if when you feed it, it is really runny, you need to feed it twice a day. It needs more flour. Add more flour, because the flour is the fuel. So give it more flour so that it can feed on that flour, and you want it to rise up and be bubbly. People push back at me all the time about this silly float test. I wouldn't necessarily do the float test for the starter. This is my starter that I've had for 2 years. It's Brady Prince, and I love him. But when I did do the experiment with this no discard starter, by the time I get done, I had about 145 grams of starter, maybe a little more. So I took out 35 grams. I still had 10 grams of flour left, or of starter left. I'm getting confused. I'm trying to go too fast. I had about 145 grams. I took out 35 grams. I had 110 grams left. So I put him in Brady Prince and incorporated him into my regular starter. Anyway, making 11, that's the next step. And that's where you're gonna need another one of these jars. So then you want to move to the bigger measuring cup for mixing. You add 100 grams of water. You add 35 grams of that new starter. Normally it's 25 of an old starter, but for a new starter I use 35 because I like to bulk it up, bulk it up a little bit. So I add 35 grams. I add 100 grams of filtered water, and I add 75 grams of bread flour, 25 grams of whole wheat flour. I mix it really, really well. I put it into one of these jars, and then I put the lid on that, and I do that at night before I go to bed, and then in the morning I wake up and it's risen to the top of the jar. Now, if you're a new baker, I would suggest, and please don't nail me on this, everybody, but I would suggest doing a float test on a new leaven. So I would add a cup of cold water and about half a teaspoon of this leaven into the water to see if it floats. It should float. It should. If it doesn't, add a little more flour, stir it up, and give it another hour or so. It'll rise again, and I bet the next time it will. After you've been baking a while, you won't do the float test anymore. It's not necessary. But I'm finding that having the different size measuring cups, the different size jars, and the different size spatulas to be a huge help. You don't need it, but if you already have them, or if you can, or bake in any way, these things are useful. I use them every day for a million different things. So now we're ready to make our dough. So now I'm going, where did I put it? Losing my marbles. Now I'm going to use my big measuring cup. What did I do with it? Oh my goodness. I don't have time for this. Anyway, oh, here it is, right in front. I'm trying to hurry because I don't want to use up all the storage on my phone. So now this is where I use the big measuring cup, and I use my kitchen scale, because now you need to start weighing things. Before you didn't really, but of course when you made your leaven, yes, 100 grams, you need your kitchen scale. I have this lovely digital kitchen scale. It was $20 at Amazon. I've been using it almost every day for one reason or another. So it's worth every penny. So when you're doing your leaven, Put your measuring cup on your scale. It should be in grams. Tear your scale back to 0. Put your 100 grams of water, 35 grams of starter, and 75 grams of bread flour and 25 grams of whole wheat into this. Mix it up, put it in your jar. Now, you've let it go overnight. It's in the it's floated in the water, and now it's time to make your dough. So this is where I use this bigger glass measuring cup, because it really helps you when you're measuring the water. Now I take my water and I put in 660 grams, and don't get mad at me, all you experienced bakers out there who like to do high hydration bread. For the new baker, the lower the hydration, the easier the dough is to handle, and the better your results. The more experienced you get, the higher the hydration you can use. I still use between 660 and 670 grams. Summer, I use less because it's warmer and everything's stickier and tackier and it proofs faster. So I use 660 grams of filtered water in my measuring cup, and I do this because I'm going to put this in my microwave, and I'm going to get it 55 seconds. I'm going to get it to about 95 degrees. During this time, while that's microwaving, I have run my water and got my water hot from my tap. I fill up my bowl to warm it up. Not necessary, especially in the summer, but I do it anyway because I don't want the cold bowl to cool off the warm water. It sort of alleviates the purpose of warming your water. So once your water is warm, you dump the water out of this bowl, which was just for warming purposes, dry it out with a towel, put it on your scale, tear your scale, add your water to your bowl, and then it's time, leave that on there. It's now time to make your dough. So you take all the water, 660 grams. I go ahead and use all of my leaven, and that's usually about 225 grams. Later on, you can put that back to 200 grams, but for me, 225 is a sweet spot. I put it all in the water. It should float. I kind of mix it up a little bit, but it's not needed. Now you add, here's the fun part, you add 910 grams of bread flour and 100 grams of whole wheat flour. Here's where my big spatula comes into play. Now, I like to mix it up with my spatula, and I scrape it off the bottoms and the sides and sort of turn it over again and again. You can do this with your hands, but I'm a little obsessive about that. I don't like getting my hand, I feel like I lose so much dough from what I can't get off my hands. So I use my big rubber sturdy spatula or silicone spatula, and I try and pull it off the bottom. Make sure you get it off the bottom and get everything moistened well. Then you put it on your stand mixer. You mix it on low for 2 minutes. You cover it to let it auto-lees, and you leave that for 30 minutes. Set your timer for 30 minutes. Then after 30 minutes, you're gonna come back. Normally during the 30 minutes, I go ahead and prepare my Cambro. This is my proofing tub. You can use any kind you want. I just found this easy to use, so I bought a bunch of these. Anyway, I like to add a little bit of olive oil, about a tablespoon or 2 of olive oil. I brush it around inside with a pastry brush just to cover just to coat all the sides, the corners, and the bottom. It makes my bread release really easy after it's been proofing, and it also gives it a nice luxurious feel to your dough, that tiny little bit of oil. So anyway, I use a Cambro. I get that prepared so that it's ready when I come back. The last thing I do to prepare is I get one of these little glass cups or metal dishes. There's a lot of these different things. They're just small, and that's why we like them. I don't know if you've seen these or if you have these. If you don't, a little measuring cup, anything is fine. I use this little glass one because I know exactly how much it weighs. It weighs 47 grams, And I don't tear the scale because 20 grams is kind of a light, it's a small amount, and it's hard to get an accurate read. So I leave it at the 47 grams that this little thing weighs, and I've used non-iodized salt, and don't give me a bad time for Morden. You can use any uniodized salt or non-iodized salt you choose. This one's just really readily available and cheap at the grocery store. You put 20 grams in here. Now mine weighs 47, so I take it up to 67 grams. Boom, it's right on the money every time. So I set that aside. I put away my scale, I put away my salt, and I'm done with that portion of my baking. Next, when your dough has finished auto-leasing after 30 minutes, you add the salt, you just sprinkle it on top. Using your dough hook, you mix it now, again, for 2 more minutes on 2, and I know KitchenAid says don't mix it on anything higher than 2, but after 2 minutes, turn it to 4, and just let it mix for 2 more minutes at speed 4 or medium-low. And after it's done mixing, now your mixing is complete. That's the end of all the mixing. And now I take my dough scraper and I scrape it off the bottom and the sides. I like to get it off the bottom because I can always find a little bit of unmixed dough in the bottom where I know it didn't mix well because it's usually the wheat flour on the bottom. It's not dry, it's wet. It's just not well incorporated. So I use my dough scraper, I get it all off. I put it in my prepared Cambro. I cover that and set my timer for 30 minutes. And then after 30 minutes, then I come in, I open it, and with a very wet hand, I gently pick it up from the corner and pull it towards the middle, just about that high. I don't do more. Rotate it a quarter and pick it up and pull it towards the center. Turn, a quarter turn, do the same thing. Do that about 4 or 5 times. That's called a stretch and fold. Cover 30 minutes, repeat, 30 minutes, repeat. Now it's time for your long counterproof. Now this depends on your weather. In the summer you leave it for a little bit less. Sometimes in the summer I'm 3.5 hours. In the winter I use a proofing box and I proof it at 80 degrees for 4 hours. And I know that seems a little bit long, and it does rise up quite high in my proofing tub, but I've found that that's the sweet spot for me. It's going to depend on your kitchen, your temperature, your humidity, a lot of things. It's very dry and cold here in the winter, and we keep our house quite cool. So I set it at about 80 degrees for 4 hours, and then I proof it in this box. Now, after the 4-hour counterproof, it's time to remove it from the box. You remove it with your dough scraper. You put it out onto a well-floured counter, and I have these little shakers that I put. This is bread flour, and I use the bread flour and I liberally shake out some on my counter. I gently get my dough to release from one side and dump it. It falls right in the flour, and I'm done with that part of it. Now I sort of bring it a little bit together, kind of get that flour tucked underneath there, and now I use my bench scraper. These are so handy for a million different things, but you really need them to cut and help you shape your dough. So you'll cut it in half, flip it over so that the side that has the flour on it is up. You need the bottom to be the sticky part. It needs to grip the counter because now you're going to be shaping it. You're going to be turning and pulling and turning and pulling because you want to get a nice tight ball. You want that nice tight ball, and this really helps you because it is generally quite sticky after this first long proof. Now you're going to put that aside. I have a breadboard, but if you just have a counter or any kind of board that you can put it on, where it's apart a little bit and has a little bit of room to grow. You cover it again with a kitchen towel, and you leave it to bench rest for 20 minutes. So set your timer. So it bench rests for 20 minutes. You come in, you do the final shaping. There are videos on the final shape of the shaping and the pre-shaping and final shaping. And then it's time to put it in a banneton. I use these linen lined bannetons. I have boules, I have batards, and I have mini batards, which I only used these for the very first time the other day. And my neighbor loved it. I didn't like it very much. The crust was very thick and she likes that. I don't. So I don't think I'll be doing that very often. I might make her a loaf now and then, but otherwise I'm gonna stick to my normal banneton size. I do not flour these. I never have my dough stick. It just comes right out. So I don't flour them. I did in the beginning, but I found out it was completely unnecessary. I have a shaker of rice flour that I almost never use. The next thing I have are these shower caps. These, you buy a whole bag of these. They're like 100 or 150 of them. They're $7, $6. And I bought this 2 years ago when I first started making sourdough, and I still have a ton of them. I dry them off, I wash them off, clean them off, and I use them again and again. So you just put this over your banneton. It fits both on that one and this one. And this one. These are also good to cover bowls that you just need to cover, like salad or something for the fridge that doesn't, you're not going to be leaving it in there for a long time or anything. They're excellent for all sorts of things. I love them. I use them every day. So now you're putting it in your refrigerator for the long cold ferment. I leave mine in usually about 10 hours. I found that if I left it in for more than about 24 hours or 36 hours or whatever, my dough, I never get any oven spring. It just stays flat. So I like to cold proof it for about 8 to 10 hours is usually fine. It works perfectly. And now it's time to take it out. But before we do, we've let it cold proof in our fridge. I did show you my kitchen thermometer, didn't I? I test my water for my bread. When I put the 660 grams in here, I use my little instant read thermometer to make sure it's between 95 and 100 degrees. I don't like it to be warmer than that. I forgot to mention that. Okay, so we've had the scale and the scrapers and the bannetons and jars and the stand mixer. If you don't have a stand mixer, you can do it by hand, but you're really going to be working it and you're going to need wet hands. Be sure your hands are wet. Now, for the bread, it's ready. It's been in my banneton overnight. It's cold. But the first thing I do is I get up very early, about 5:30 in the morning, and I put my cooking vessel. If I'm going to make a round, I have a 6-quart cast iron Dutch oven like this. It's just a cheap Lodge, or but it's heavy, and this thing is a workhorse. I don't have to season or clean it or do anything to it because I only use it to bake bread, and my bread absolutely never touches the pan. So I never bother to, I just dust out if there's any little bit of flour, but the bread never actually touches the surface. So I just put it in the oven, empty like this. I turn my oven to 550 degrees and I preheat it. It takes about 45 minutes. If I'm making a batard, and this is where I know I'm really lucky, but this thing weighs a ton, I use my Challenger. This is also cast iron, but it's perfect for a batard. It's long and kind of oblong, so it's very nice for a batard. It also, I can make 2 French baguettes at a time on this thing, which is really lovely, and I do make French baguettes. Oh, for heaven's sakes. It is so heavy. Okay. Now, if you don't have a cast iron, you don't have a Dutch oven or a Challenger, there's something else you can do. The idea is to trap steam as you bake. So I would put your parchment, I wouldn't preheat this because it's aluminum and not steel. If you have a steel, preheat it. If it's stainless steel, a solid steel, or an oven steel, for example, I have one of those, you can cook it on that, or a pizza stone will do. Preheat that in the 550-degree oven. Do not preheat this. So what you're gonna do is you're gonna take your bread out of your banneton and put the parchment paper over it. You're gonna just flip it over, and now you're gonna score it. So there's different ways of scoring it. I have my trusty safety razor blades, which I love because they're only sharp on one side, as opposed to blades that are sharp on both sides. I don't know if you can see, but this has a safety side, and that's the side that you use to press down on. And this is the sharp side, and I don't use that. I had a bunch of blades that were double-edged, and I was forever cutting my finger. The next thing you can use is a lame, which is just a razor blade on a plastic stick or a wooden stick, and you score your bread. I don't have very good luck with lames, so I like to use my safety blades. You score it. I also have one of these things. I don't like it. I don't use it. I can't get a good ear using one of these, so I don't use it. My daughter uses hers all the time and really loves it. You score your bread, you make your decorations. If you're going to want to score it with a decorative pattern that you want to show up, spray your bread with some water first. I have my glass spray bottle. I don't want any plastic leaching into the water. Spray your bread, give it a nice good spritz after you've scored, and then dust on, let's see, let's make sure I'm telling you to do this right. Yes, if you put your rice flour on beforehand, when you spray it, you wash it all away. So I put my water on, I spray it first, I rub in a bunch of rice flour after I've scored, and then I just pick this whole thing up, dough and all, and set it right inside my very hot Dutch oven or Challenger. If you're using the baking sheet, cooking sheet, make sure it's inverted, it's upside down, place your dough on top of it, and then take one of these cheap aluminum foil roasting pans, and you can use it again and again and again, and cover your bread. So make sure it's not as big as your roasting pan, because you want it to cover it completely. That's gonna trap steam in there, and that steam will help your bread have oven spring. You'll get a much better oven spring. It'll rise higher in the cooking. So you cook it that way, lower the temperature to 485, cook it covered for at least 20 minutes, take the cover off after 20 minutes, turn it down to about 465 or 70, cook it for another 20 to 22, 24 minutes, however dark you like your bread. Then when it comes out, all you have to do is put it on a cooling rack. I got this one that I absolutely love. It's very high, and I like the height. It allows the bread to to cool all around. The lower ones that are almost right on the counter, I was propping up with books. Now I use this thing, which is quite high. I really like it. And so this one I love. I let it cool a minimum of 45 minutes. If you cut it beforehand, you lose all that steam in your bread and it dries it out. And it's just not gonna have the same texture. It's not gonna have the same quality. So wait at least 45 minutes. Be patient. The one thing I have to say about making sourdough is patience is essential. Patience with your starter, patience with your leaven, patience with your proofing, mixing, shaping, proofing, absolutely everything. You have to be patient. Now, for storage, I bought these bags. I will not store them in these bags because once cut, the bread is going to dry out. It is a linen or canvas bag, and I bought a ton of them, but I use those for gifting. When I'm going to give a neighbor or a friend or as a gift at Christmas bread, I have all of these lovely bags and I have different sizes. So depending on the size of my bread, I can put them in there. But for our daily storage, and this is one of those tiny loaves that I made the other day in my tiny bannetons. It's very small. I put it in Ziploc and I suck the air out. Oh, awful. I just suck the air out. And it keeps it fresh. Now this has been 2 days, so I need to put this in the refrigerator now because it's going to mold if I leave it sit out any longer. It's much too warm in our house. So that's about it. I think that's everything you need. Be sure to try and have a few things on hand when you first decide you're going to try sourdough. Jars, measuring cups, sturdy wooden spoons or spatulas. If you can, get a couple of these glass jars anywhere. Don't use the plastic because the water sits in here and it can just leach plastic into the water. So I wouldn't advise that. They have these bannetons, they have these sourdough kits on Amazon for about $27 the last time I looked. And look in thrift shops, look at garage sales, estate sales. You're gonna find ball jars. People end up with so many they can't give them away. So look for those. Check for a cast iron Dutch oven at an estate sale, a thrift shop. If you can find one with a lid, that's great. I have a nice enameled one. I won't use my enameled one because I put it in the oven at 550 degrees and heat it up empty. I don't want to crack the enamel. I don't want to ruin it. So I just use the straight cast iron, uncoated, and I don't even bother to season it. So it's perfectly fine. If you don't have a stand mixer, check eBay, check estate sales, check Craigslist, whatever. Try and find yourself a stand mixer. My first one I got in an estate sale. It was a 6-quart KitchenAid Pro. It was wonderful, but it had been used like crazy. I cleaned it all up. It was beautiful and it worked for a year. And then the motor just blew up and I took it to the repairman. He said it would cost more to buy a new motor than to buy a new one, and I think he was right. So I got a new one. I love it. I know lots of people use all sorts of things besides KitchenAid, and I find the 6-quart is best. If you're making the 2-loaf recipe that I use, the dough will ride up the hook and go right up the top. If you use a smaller one, a 4.5-quart or whatever, it's too much dough. So you need a 6-quart if you can find one. If you can't, just make half recipes or only mix, half the dough at a time. I don't know what to tell you. But I think that's about it. I think I covered everything that you might be curious about. Let me check my list. Yeah, I think I got it. Wow, okay, I didn't run out of storage. Okay, so if you have more questions, join Bread Making for Beginners and ask me there. If you ask me in comments here, since I'm not a content creator and I only upload videos occasionally for information purposes for my bread group. I hardly ever check the comments, so I feel terrible because the comments show up on a Google email account I have, and I don't use Google email, so I never see them. It's very frustrating. And that was the only account that that YouTube would let me link to, was the Google. So anyway, so either join my Facebook group, little bread makers for beginners, and I'll be happy to answer all your questions. I feel like I'm still kind of a beginner, but I do know about sourdough now. I feel a little more expert on sourdough. And if I don't know, somebody in that group does, because we have 57,000 members. So a lot of beginners, lots of novices. And this little video was for all you beginners. So thank you for staying with me for all this long, boring time. And I hope it helps. If you have questions, go to Facebook, Bread Making for Beginners, and I'll be happy to answer. Thank you. Happy baking. See you next time.